Boa noite. Ele é um dos mais importantes nomes do jornalismo mundial. No centro do Roda Viva está Carl Bernstein.
Quando surgiu o que parecia ser um incidente menor ligado a um certo hotel Watergate, um jovem repórter mostrou que tinha faro para grandes furos. Carl Bernstein, então com 20 anos, em memorável parceria com Bob Woodward, começou a desenrolar o novelo daquela que seria uma das mais importantes reportagens do século. Das páginas do Washington Post, suas matérias sobre o escândalo de espionagem política e eleitoral que envolvia a alta cúpula do Partido Republicano chegaram a uma instância mais alta, a própria Casa Branca. E assim, Richard Nixon passou à história como um dos únicos presidentes derrubados pela silenciosa artilharia das páginas de um jornal. A reportagem se transformou em livro e depois em filme de sucesso, com o nome de Todos os Homens do Presidente. Continuando na mesma trilha, Bernstein acaba de lançar no mundo inteiro, agora também no Brasil, uma nova obra que já desperta polêmica. Sua Santidade João Paulo II, livro escrito em parceria com o jornalista italiano Marco Politi, desvenda em alguns capítulos os bastidores dos últimos anos da Guerra Fria. E, naturalmente, a participação do Papa nesses fatos. Vários analistas o criticam por dar tamanha importância ao papel de João Paulo II no desmantelamento do comunismo na Europa Oriental. Bernstein responde que a ofensiva sigilosa e discreta do Papa polonês está se tornando cada dia mais transparente à luz dos acontecimentos históricos. Diz ele, sem levar a atuação de João Paulo II em conta, é impossível entender corretamente o período. Fatos mais recentes avalizam essa afirmação. Há pouco tempo, João Paulo II recebeu em seu gabinete particular Fidel Castro, líder de um dos últimos regimes comunistas na Terra. E já tem programada uma viagem a Cuba para 1997. Aos críticos de Bernstein, um lembrete. Nos anos 70, João Paulo II se aproximou do Solidariedade e empenhou-se pessoalmente em extensas maratonas religiosas na então comunista Polônia. Dentro e fora dos bastidores, o Papa atuou decisivamente para enfraquecer o governo comunista que então havia na sua terra natal. À luz do que demonstra Bernstein em seu livro, Cuba e China podem ser os últimos redutos do inimigo ateu na mira do envelhecido, mas obstinado pontífice.
Para entrevistar o Carl Bernstein, nós convidamos essa noite o jornalista Augusto Nunes, que é vice-presidente de comunicação do Banco de Boston, o Alberto Dines, do Laboratório de Estudos Avançados de Jornalismo da Unicamp e do Observatório da Imprensa, a Andréa Fornes, jornalista da Folha de São Paulo, o Igor Fuser, jornalista da revista Veja, o Mário Sérgio Cortella, professor de Teologia e Ciência da Religião da Universidade Católica de São Paulo, o professor Carlos Alberto de Franco, professor de Ética Jornalística, o jornalista Sérgio Mota Mello, diretor da produtora TV1, e o professor Roberto Romano, do Departamento de Filosofia da Unicamp. O Roda Viva é transmitido em rede nacional por 150 outras emissoras de 21 estados brasileiros. Hoje você não poderá participar do nosso programa, você não poderá enviar as suas perguntas, porque esse programa foi gravado. O jornalista Carl Bernstein está lançando, junto com o jornalista italiano Marco Politi, o livro Sua Santidade, João Paulo II e a História Oculta do Nosso Tempo. Boa noite, senhor Bernstein.
It's good to be here.
Senhor Bernstein, recentemente o Fidel Castro esteve com o Papa e o Papa anunciou uma visita a Cuba. Como o seu livro fala da participação do Papa no processo de abertura nos chamados países do leste europeu, como o senhor interpretaria essa visita do Papa ou esse encontro do Papa com Fidel Castro?
I think the first thing you have to understand both about the Pope and about this book is that this is a biography of the most extraordinary man of the last part of our century. And that to understand him even going back to his childhood, as we do in this book, you have to understand that above all else, he is a mystic. That he is a man who prays 6 to 8 hours a day, who throws himself down on the cold marble floor of the Vatican chapel with his arms extended in the form of a cross, who, when he was shot, thought that the devil did this thing, he said. The devil did this, and I don't care who the devil conspired with. So he's a mystic before he is anything else. So I think we have to look at his confrontation with communism in his native Poland, which took place through the basic assertion of God-given human rights, not through usual anti-communist rhetoric, but rather, again, he saw this struggle as in almost mystical terms. And above all, this Pope is an evangelist. He regards Cuba as a Catholic country with a Catholic soul. So he was going there to evangelize Cuba. He is going to assert human rights, as he did in both left-wing and right-wing dictatorships, in his own Poland, in Argentina, in the countries of the Americas that were under oligarchies and right-wing dictatorships. Obviously, he also is a man who, though he was a great anti-communist warrior, has preached with even more fury against the excesses of capitalism, what he calls a lumpen capitalism, than he has against communism. And he comes back to this mystical tradition he comes from. He comes from a tradition of Polish messianism that held that Poland was the Christ of nations, that after all of Poland's suffering and the partitions and the slaughters and the wars, that it would be resurrected and show mankind to a new spiritual enlightenment. And during Solidarity's struggle in Poland, Solidarity, this anti-communist alliance of workers behind the Iron Curtain, he believed that that messianic vision of Poland was taking place. And again, as a mystic, he believed that Russia would be reconverted to Christianity. But instead of ex-Orient lux, a light from the east, coming from the former lands of the Soviet Empire, he now sees what he regards as the worst excesses of capitalist excess, of materialism, of racism, of tribalism, of nationalism. So I think that he is also going to be looking in Cuba for things that he sees as positive in Castro's revolution. And he's somebody who values labor above capital. So I think it's going to be a fascinating visit, but to think that it is going to be an anti-communist tirade is to misunderstand this Pope.
Carl, é uma pergunta de caráter pessoal, biográfico. Você entrou aqui no estúdio dizendo "Oi, vez mir", uma expressão em Yiddish, né? Que eu consegui identificar. Mas não é sobre isso que eu quero perguntar. A curiosidade, ou coincidência, é que a biografia anterior de Sua Santidade, o Papa, foi escrita por um judeu chamado Tad Schultz, que, aliás, viveu no Brasil e fala português perfeitamente. A nova biografia é escrita por um outro judeu, e imagino que Marco Politi também seja judeu, porque o nome Politi é um nome levantino típico, né? Como é que você explica essa fascinação de 3 judeus pela figura de Sua Santidade, apenas porque ele reconheceu o Estado de Israel, ou porque ele na juventude namorou uma menina judia, ou porque ele foi o Papa que mais conviveu com a comunidade judaica, como de fato conviveu?
Ou porque o fundador do cristianismo era judeu, né?
Ou talvez por isso?
Well, obviously that I could say that Jews have always liked to keep a close watch on what Christians are doing. But that's not the real answer. First of all, Marco Politi is not Jewish. Marco was raised as a Catholic, and one of the reasons I wanted a collaborator to assist me on this book is I have no background in theology, in Christianity, in covering the Vatican. So Marco had covered the Vatican for 15 years, and he seemed to me to be the ideal collaborator who could help me understand what I was reporting and the significance of a bunch of the information and put it in a historical context that I lacked. I don't think, though, that I'm a secular Jew, incidentally. I'm not a religious Jew. I don't think that I approached this subject, though, because of my Jewishness. I wrote a cover story for Time magazine in 1992 saying that Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II had collaborated secretly to help keep solidarity alive in Poland after the imposition of martial law, and that they had pursued parallel interests of the Holy See and the United States in other areas of the world, particularly Central America. And after I wrote that story, Gorbachev wrote a response in La Stampa, the Italian newspaper, that the New York Times reprinted, saying, yes, and without this Pope, none of the events in Eastern Europe would have occurred. And at that point, I said to myself, this man is the great story of our time. And nobody knows what a Pope really does. And this man has not only been the pivotal figure in the collapse of communism, hastening through his actions and protecting solidarity the collapse of communism, certainly not the cause of it, but hastening it. He's not only the pivotal figure, but also he has challenged the whole notion of conventional Western morality. This is a remarkable thing to be doing at the end of the 20th century, and this is a man who has had an impact on our time not unlike that of a Churchill or a Roosevelt. And a book on a sitting Pope had never been written before that explained what has he done and how has he done it. So I thought, all my books are about power. And All the President's Men with Bob Woodward, The Final Days, about Nixon's last days, my last book, Loyalties, son's memoir about my own family's encounter with the abuse of power in McCarthyism. Well, here is somebody who exercises incredible spiritual power and at the same time great geopolitical power and sensibility. And we've never seen this combination in a leader in our time. And that is the source of so much of his impact. So I was fascinated by this. And obviously, though, one of the things that distinguishes this Pope, he is different than all other modern popes. First of all, he's the first non-Italian Pope in 450 years. He's Polish. But one of the things that I've already said that you need to understand is mysticism as the basis of almost everything that he does. For instance, I had thought that I would go into this like I went into the White House and I would find out about all these meetings that had taken place and what the Pope said and how he and his advisors discussed and debated issues and looked at various options. Wrong. There's one meeting. Him on his knees with God. That's the meeting. His aides come in and tell him what they're doing to carry out his policies that he divined when he was on his knees. So it's a very different kind of story than I'm accustomed to covering in that regard. But among the things that makes him so different than other popes is he's the first pope since Peter to grow up in a Jewish milieu. And you have to understand that, to understand part of his greatness. Because his father took him to a synagogue as a young boy to hear a great cantor sing the Kol Nidre on the high holidays. His father was a man utterly without prejudice in a pre-war Poland that was infected with terrible, vile anti-Semitism. His town that he grew up in was 20 to 25% Jewish. His landlord was Jewish. His closest friend in a public school, not a parochial school, not a seminary like every other pope has gone to. He went to a public school. His closest friend was Jewish, a man who remains his close friend to this day. He had a crush on a Jewish girl. He learned to dance, hold girls in his arms while he danced with them, and his favorite was a Jewish girl, Ginka Beer, who we interviewed, and we tell the story of their relationship in this book. He then became Archbishop of the diocese that included Auschwitz. And many of those classmates who he went to school with died at Auschwitz. He has, as the Israeli ambassador to the Vatican said to me, put the church on a course that it can never revert to anti-Semitism. He has declared that the millennial observance of the Catholic Church, again back to his mysticism, the millennium is a huge event in the life of the church and in his own life, and he's looking forward to being alive for the millennium. He has dedicated the Jubilee year, which is a Jewish tradition actually, to Catholic reflection on the sins of the church itself, particularly the sins of anti-Semitism and the Inquisition. He has recognized the state of Israel over the objections of his own curie. So he has gone to the synagogue, the first pope to cross the Tiber and go to the synagogue in Rome across from St. Peter's. So his relationship to Judaism is absolutely essential to understanding him, because Auschwitz is a place where millions of Jews died and millions of Poles died. And he regards this as one of the two or three great influences in his life. The presence of Jews in his life, whom he calls the elder brothers of Christians. His experience as a worker, the only pope to be a worker, which is crucial to understanding his assertion of the right to organize into labor unions, a right that he declared here in São Paulo when he came to visit Brazil, and which of course he declared over and over again in defense of solidarity, this amazing movement behind the Iron Curtain. So it's a rather long answer to your question, but understanding his relationship to Judaism is absolutely essential, because if there's anything he believes that the millennium should be about, it is finally that Christians, Jews, and Muslims, that the great faiths of the world must coexist.
Ted Schuch entrevistou o Papa para escrever o seu livro. No seu livro não há uma entrevista com o Papa. Isso atrapalhou o seu processo de apuração?
Not at all. Actually, Ted Schultz's book, there's really no evidence of any meaningful interview. This is not a pope who uses interviews to really divulge things. If I had had an interview, and of course I asked for one, I would have spoken to the Pope and asked him about his faith, not about his relationship with Reagan, not about how he came to his positions on various issues. I'd like to know whether he ever had a crisis of faith, those kinds of questions, how he came to his faith, what was the moment that he decided not to be an actor. He had thought he was going to be an actor, and of course he remains a great actor. This remarkable theater, religious theater he conducts seated alone on a bare stage with a cross 60 feet high behind him, holding millions of people spellbound. So I think the important thing about this book is that it is the first real biography that goes back to his childhood through his papacy, in which hundreds of people have been interviewed and who knew and know him best. I was able, for instance, for the first time, to be someone to get to interview repeatedly Cardinal Andrés Descour, who is the man in the Vatican closest to the Pope. He went to the underground seminary with him before World War II, or during World War II in Poland. In this book, we name our sources. There are footnotes throughout the book. And I think what they demonstrate is that we have done a massive job of reporting that for the first time rises above what has really been some terrible journalism about this Pope, about this papacy, so that people can understand for the first time, who is this man? What has he done? What has the impact of his papacy been on our time? And one of the things we've done, in addition to those that we've interviewed, is that we have obtained the secret minutes of the Soviet Politburo from the 1980s dealing with the Pope and Poland. And what they show is the Politburo's terror and frustration with this Pope and with solidarity. How many divisions does the Pope have, Stalin asked? Well, the answer comes in these remarkable Politburo minutes. 6 weeks after the formation of Solidarity, we hear Brezhnev open a meeting of the Politburo behind the Kremlin walls by saying, the counter-revolution in Poland is in full force. Lech Walesa runs from one end of the country to the other. Nobody does anything to stop him. People bow before the Pope on his knees. And then Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister who served every Soviet leader since Stalin, says, we cannot lose Poland. If we lose, the Soviet Union lost 600,000 troops and officers to liberate Poland in World War II. We cannot lose Poland. Well, imagine what that now means in terms of understanding the end of communism and what happened in the 1980s. That within 6 weeks of Solidarity's formation in the Kremlin, they were talking, we now know, about losing Poland. And 6 months later, a comrade Babikov, member of the Politburo, comes back from a fact-finding mission to Warsaw and stuns his colleagues on the Politburo by saying that Lech Walesa, backed by the episcopate, that is to say by this Polish Pope and the Polish Church, now controls the country, not the Communist Party. And then Ustinov, the aging defense minister, says to his colleagues, unless we are willing to shed blood in Poland, we could lose all the achievements of socialism, all the achievements of the revolution. So we now know from these secret Politburo meetings and these minutes that we've obtained that they were talking within 6 months, in 1981, about what actually occurred in 1989, the collapse of communism because of what was happening in this papacy, in Poland, and the pressure that was being exerted on the whole Soviet system.
Senhor Bernstein.
Senhor Bernstein, Alfred de Vigny, no século passado, imagina um diálogo entre o Papa Pio VII e Napoleão Bonaparte. O Papa, refém do imperador para a sagração que seria no dia seguinte, Notre-Dame, recusa as ofertas de amizade do imperador. E Napoleão usa, na primeira vez, uma retórica persuasiva, e o Papa se cala. Depois de um silêncio mortal, Pio VII exclama, comediante. O imperador, enfurecido, berra ameaças. Depois lamenta a solidão do poder. Tragediante, responde o Papa. O senhor analisou João Paulo II, ao longo de todo o seu livro, desde o começo até o final, como artista. Só que ele é sempre ator principal, mesmo ao lado de Ronald Reagan. Do início ao fim da carreira do Papa, ele é um ator frio, sem emoções, que controla seus próprios sentimentos. Só que João Paulo II contracena com canastrões terríveis, mais ou menos bem-sucedidos. Faltou-lhe um coadjuvante à altura, com a possível exceção de Reagan. No seu entender, o Papa, para lembrar a tipologia de Vigny, é comediante, tragediante ou as duas coisas ao mesmo tempo?
I'm not sure I agree with your reading of the book. I think that this is a very nuanced picture of a very complicated man. It is above all about a man who is full of contradiction. A great anti-communist warrior, but not a Democrat. A solitary and a mystic, and yet a man who has been seen and heard by more individuals than any person in the history of the earth. His acting is central to his life, but I also wouldn't overestimate it, and I think your question is perhaps making too much of his acting. And incidentally, when I talk about acting, I am not talking about a falseness. I'm talking about what a great actor summons, which is real feeling, real emotion. And he learned to act in a remarkable religious theater that fused Polish mysticism and Christian passion plays, but also was called the theater of the living word, which was the idea that the stage would be stripped of sets and the intonation of the words would be what would carry the drama. And of course, he does that. He is absolutely spellbinding when you watch him. But I think what this book is the first real picture of the whole man, of the contradictions, of the greatest humanist, perhaps, of our time, a man who speaks out against what he calls economic imperialism, against racism, against tribalism, against nationalism, and at the same time, whose humanism has been undermined, unquestionably, by his pronouncements on women, on sexuality. Again, the contradictions of the man. So I think what we try to do in this book is, Garcia Marquez read the book and said an amazing thing about it. He said, one reads this book with all the admiration, terror, pace, and mystery of a great political thriller. And I think that this Pope's life is a great drama. In that sense, it is a great drama, it is a great story. It is also a book very much about understanding our time. Until we are able to understand what this Pope did in Poland and what he and Ronald Reagan did together, because they formed an alliance to pursue parallel policies, not only in Poland, but in the Catholic countries of the Americas, in Salvador, Nicaragua, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, also in the Philippines, Catholic countries in which right-wing dictatorships in the early 1980s, old oligarchies, the Holy See and Ronald Reagan wanted to see those dictatorships end. But they did not want to see, they wanted to move those countries to pluralism, but not in such a way that left-wing or Marxist-oriented forces would come to power. So their alliance was about this as well. It's a great geopolitical moment in modern history. It also, though, goes back to the Pope's spirituality. He was against liberation theology, not on geopolitical grounds, but he believes that the perennial theology is sufficient for the liberation of mankind, though many people in this country would disagree.
O senhor, no seu livro, descreve várias vezes uma admiração pelo Papa. Aparece, inclusive, a sua forma de mostrar a política do Vaticano. No nosso país, no Brasil, muita gente, principalmente da elite, faz referência à ideia de que a Igreja Católica ou outra igreja não deva se misturar com política. O senhor escreveu uma obra sobre o macartismo, na qual até a sua família acabou sendo perseguida. O senhor falou antes, na resposta ao Dines, em relação aos pecados da Igreja Católica, quanto à perseguição aos judeus e à Inquisição. E o mesmo personagem da sua obra, que o senhor admira, ele é descrito numa determinada situação, na sua obra, o interrogatório que foi feito em relação a Leonardo Boff, um brasileiro, né, que na época era um frade dominicano, que em 1984 foi interrogado no Vaticano. Esse interrogatório se assemelha um pouco às atividades da Inquisição ou até do tipo de prática que o Congresso americano fazia no macartismo. Como é que fica a sua admiração por essa relação da política do Papa, quando esses recursos também são utilizados como uma forma de imposição de determinadas perspectivas?
Again, I think I need perhaps to explain a little more about what we do in this book. I think that this book is a work like The Final Days about Richard Nixon. It is a work above all else of reporting the best obtainable version of the truth. And you correctly point out that there is a whole section about the Inquisition of Leonardo Boff, in which the Pope acts like the authoritarian he is. He is an authoritarian. He's not a Democrat. And he has throttled all dissent in the church. And certainly there is nothing admiring in the portrait of him in his dealings with Leonardo Boff. What this book is, I think again, this book is about the complexity of a man, as I said, a great humanist who at the same time, his humanism has been undermined. I just said it, and the book makes it clear. It is not only about his triumphs, it's about his defeats. And the great defeat has come with women, but also the whole question of democracy in the church. This papacy has made it impossible for democracy to come to the church. I think the next pontificate We are going to see more collegiality, that term that the cardinals use to describe power sharing in the church. I think this pope is probably going to be the last absolute monarch of the Catholic Church. There have been millions of Catholics in the West particularly who have left the church during his papacy. But this book is not meant to be either admiring or deprecating. This book is meant to be truthful, what really good reporting is, the best obtainable version of the truth. And for the first time, we see the man in all his complexity. There's an amazing scene, as you have said about it, an inquisition conducted by Cardinal Ratzinger, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, with the Pope's approval of Leonardo Boff. It is an awful scene. There is also, at the end of the book, a confrontation with the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, a woman, Dr. Nafis Sadiq, in which she confronts the Pope and says, "You're not a compassionate man," in which he appears absolutely ignorant of, indeed, things that are happening in his own church in Latin America in terms of sexuality. And she calls him on it. So this book is not meant to be a tract of any kind. It is meant to illuminate our time. The hidden history of our time is the subtitle of it. And that scene with Boff is part of the hidden history of our time. That scene with Dr. Nafis Sadiq is part of the hidden history of our time, just as his dealings with Reagan, with Gorbachev, with Jaruzelski are part of the hidden history of our time.
Me chamou muito a atenção no seu livro o fato de que, embora, enfim, imagino que, enfim, grande parte do seu livro é dedicado à atuação política do Papa em relação ao leste europeu. Mas não existe nenhuma única menção, por exemplo, ao arcebispo Dom Oscar Romero, que foi assassinado em El Salvador, né, durante o pontificado do Papa. E o que me chama a atenção como brasileiro, na trajetória do Papa, o senhor fala da complexidade da figura do Papa e das contradições que marcam a trajetória do Papa, esse fato de que ele sempre estimulou a participação política, militante, ativa, hiperativa no leste europeu contra o comunismo e sempre desestimulou e mesmo combateu a atuação política da Igreja na América Latina quando a Igreja se levantou contra as injustiças em favor de camponeses que lutam pela reforma agrária e assim por diante. Nesse caso, o Papa sempre disse, não, a Igreja não pode se meter com política. Mas na Polônia não só podia, como devia, e o seu próprio livro mostra, ele se aliou com a CIA, né, contra o regime polonês. Essa é uma grande contradição e que segue vigente ainda hoje. Não me parece que o seu livro e a sua entrevista contemple essa contradição. Pelo menos aqui nas referências no índice remissivo do livro, não menciona Dom Oscar Romero. Quer dizer, se de repente tem alguma menção menor, porque não mereceu, não está contemplada aqui no remissivo. Mas, de qualquer maneira, esse contraste que como brasileiro, me espanta.
First of all, I don't think you've read the book. Am I correct?
Não completamente. Agora,
okay.
Não há uma única referência no remissivo.
All right. Let me. Okay, it's not. I looked. It is not in the index. There is a section on Romero, and it says exactly what you've said. It says that this Pope venerates Saint Stanislaus, and who is the great Polish saint, and that when he came to Salvador, he barely paid lip service to Romero, who is the Saint Stanislaus of the Americas. The book says exactly what you are saying. There is a whole chapter on the Pope's visit to Salvador and to Nicaragua, to Argentina and Chile, which the book says is one of the least admirable aspects of the whole papacy, because during that trip, The Pope did not preach human rights with the same passion and advocacy that he did in Poland. What you are saying, I think, is quite accurate about the contradictions. But to say that the contradictions are not in the book is absolutely inaccurate. In fact, this book is about those contradictions. Let me just say one other thing. You talk at one point, though, about the Pope working with the CIA. This book does not say that the Holy See and the CIA undertook covert operations together. It does not say that the Pope was a captive of the CIA. He wasn't. And certainly Solidarity, despite the fact that it received $50 million in aid from the CIA underground to help it broadcast and publish, Solidarity was an indigenous movement of Poles. It was not a product of the CIA in any way. And William Casey, Reagan's CIA director, indeed engaged in a stunning and unique, what he called geopolitical dialogue with this Pope. He visited secretly with the Pope half a dozen times. Casey was a extremely religious Catholic who went to Mass every day. He had statues of the Virgin all around his house. He and the Pope had both a geostrategic discussion centered on Poland, the idea of how Solidarity's gains could be protected without provoking intervention from the Soviets, from the Warsaw Pact. And at the same time, these commonality of interest in these Catholic countries of the Americas were also the center of this geostrategic doctrine.
Talvez, falando em termos de contradição, talvez a maior contradição aparente, a maior percepção de maior contradição da gestão do Papa, talvez fosse a de que ele, sendo um homem místico, evangélico, religioso e não um político, tenha tido como resultado, eu diria, seriam os grandes resultados da gestão do Papa, né? Como resultado, acontecimentos de maior impacto na área política do que na área religiosa. Quer dizer, ele, não sendo um político, transformou o mundo politicamente e, sendo um religioso, não fez grandes transformações ao ponto de que perdeu audiência, né? A Igreja Católica hoje perdeu o público para outras igrejas, para outras religiões. Qual é a função do Papa?
Well, I disagree with you. I tell you why I disagree with you. Your question presupposes that because the Pope doesn't do what you and I would like to see him do, that he's irrelevant.
I'm not saying that.
That in effect is what you're saying. You're saying that he has done nothing in regard to his church. The fact is, he has done an awful lot in regard to his church. You or I might not like what he has done in terms of democracy in his church.
Estou falando de resultados. O fato é, os grandes resultados em termos de audiência, de público da Igreja, a Igreja Católica vem perdendo audiência, vem perdendo público para outras religiões. Eu não estou falando da minha opinião, estou dizendo fatos.
Again, this Pope would say that he's not interested in the numbers of Catholics in the West, but rather that Catholicism is a demanding faith. And that if Catholics are going to be Catholics, they have to follow the precepts of the Church. I might not agree with this, but it's a matter of fact. And the other central fact about this papacy is that when this Pope took over the Church, its identity was very confused. It was a church drifting. Nobody quite knew what it stood for. Whatever you say about this church now, we know what it stands for. We know that this Pope's church does not stand for liberation theology. We know that this Pope's church stands against leftist movements. We know that this Pope's church is against democracy in its own house. We know that this Pope's church does not believe in the ordination of women priests. We know that this Pope's church does not believe in divorce, that contraception, even in the age of AIDS, is prohibitive, etc., etc., etc. He has defined his church I might not like how he's defined it, but my job is to help people understand how he's defined it. And at the same time, despite all of those, what you, I think, from the tenor of your question, would regard as negative aspects of his papacy. Indeed, people in the West have left the church in droves, particularly women, particularly young people. Cardinal Ratzinger has had something very interesting to say about this, and that is, though, that the age of the church, of Catholicism, of Christianity, as the great enveloping force that rules all precepts of people's lives, that era is over. So what is his church about? His church is about the faithful. He is looking for the faithful, and he's found them in Africa, and he's found them in Latin America. Some of them in his own church, some of them who disagree with him are in the church of, in the People's Church. All I'm trying to do in this book, and I think that what a lot of these questions indicate, is how we have a debate over this Pope without knowing what he's doing. And what I'm so happy about doing is to make the facts available so that we can finally have a knowledgeable debate. And that, we can't have a knowledgeable debate about either our time or this man until we know the facts. And I'm here to tell you that most of the facts in this book are new, and that our portrait of this leader is new, and that our look at the end of the Cold War through these secret documents, through interviewing General Jaruzelski for 30-something hours, through interviewing Ronald Reagan in 1991, through interviewing Cardinal Pio Laghi, the apostolic delegate in Washington, Silvestrini, Descour, the people who went to school with him. Finally, we have a real picture based on a kind of reporting and historical inquiry that a great figure deserves. Then begin the debate.
Sr. Bernstein, eu aproveito o gancho do Sérgio para ir numa outra direção. A mim me parece que o que explica o sucesso do Papa é uma dimensão muito mais ética, moral e religiosa do que provavelmente política. João Paulo é um grande diplomata? É. João Paulo II é um homem com grande habilidade? Sem dúvida. Mas quando você vê uma reunião como a de Denver nos Estados Unidos, quando você vê uma reunião como a de Manila nas Filipinas, com uma quantidade impressionante de jovens ouvindo um discurso fortemente comprometedor, não estavam num show de rock, estavam vendo alguém falando e fazendo apelos éticos muito fortes. A minha pergunta é a seguinte: será que, de alguma maneira, o Papa não galvaniza um mundo que está sedento de liberdade, mas ao mesmo tempo nostálgico de certezas? Quer dizer, e a força das suas convicções é que produzem essa enorme atração à sua figura. Eu gostaria que comentasse um pouco essa dimensão ética, moral e religiosa de João Paulo II.
Well, the book itself is very much about the ethical dimension of the papacy of John Paul II, because he is an ethicist, he is a philosopher, and the amazing thing to me is that given the nature of what he is saying at our time, at the end of the century, and how so much of it runs counter to the dominant ethics of our time, and yet he has had a huge effect. For instance, take a look at the debate over abortion. I obviously hold a different position than the Pope does, but one of the things that amazes me is that he's been so effective in changing the terms of the debate around the world. That the debate in the United States over abortion and the shift to the right on this question in the United States is partly because of this Pope. He is, above all, concerned with questions of what God intended for man. And he is very strict about what he thinks God intended for man. He thinks God intended for man what the basic precepts of Catholicism are. And he does not want to see those precepts changed. And he preaches that people must uphold these precepts. There are many in his church who would say that this brings forth an intolerance, in fact, and that's one of the reasons he's been such a controversial pope. But he is very much, again, I said at the beginning, the amazing thing about this pope is he combines spiritual power with an acute geopolitical sensibility. And that's what makes him unique, and that's what makes him such a force. So he has both moral force and geopolitical force.
Ok, Mr. Bernstein, nós vamos fazer agora um pequeno intervalo e a gente volta daqui a pouquinho com a segunda parte da entrevista com o jornalista americano Carl Bernstein. Até já. Bem, nós voltamos com Roda Viva, que entrevista essa noite o jornalista americano Carl Bernstein. Ele está lançando no Brasil o seu livro Sua Santidade João Paulo II e a História Oculta do Nosso Tempo. Nós lembramos mais uma vez que esse programa foi gravado, portanto, nós não estamos podendo, infelizmente, receber as suas perguntas. Nós falamos bastante sobre o Papa no primeiro bloco desse programa, agora vamos falar um pouco sobre imprensa e eu acho que o Augusto Nunes está ali com uma pergunta para o Bernstein sobre imprensa. Augusto.
Mr. Bernstein, o senhor produziu excelentes trabalhos no sistema de parceria, primeiro com o Bob Woodward, agora com o Marco Politi. Esta fórmula, parceria, é pouco usada no Brasil. Então, perguntaria, qual é o segredo? Existe alguma fórmula capaz de afinar, ajustar temperamentos, estilos, modos de trabalhar diferentes, como são necessariamente de um jornalista, como o senhor e do Marco Politi?
Partnerships work sometimes and they don't other times. Sometimes they're appropriate, sometimes they're not appropriate. I've been lucky enough, with Bob Woodward especially, to be in a relationship where we really complemented each other's skills. And with Marco, some of the same thing happened. He's much more a European journalist. He's much more an interpreter than a reporter.
Qual a diferença, qual a diferença, senhor permite um corte, entre o estilo jornalístico europeu e o estilo americano?
Right. Well, European journalism tends to be much more about analysis and interpretation than it does about going out and learning new facts. It will take a speech by the Pope and then try to make sense out of it, but without going to find out, well, how did the Pope come to this decision? Who does the Pope want to reach by this? Without real reporting. Reporting is the best obtainable version of the truth. All good reporting is the same thing. The best obtainable version of the truth. And I think that often, by having the energies of two people, by switching roles sometimes one might usually be the harder reporter, the other one the analytical one, and then you switch sometimes.
Mas, desculpe, o senhor concordou com todas as interpretações feitas pelo Marco Politi?
They're not Marco's, they're ours collectively. We debated them. There's not a single thing in there that I just, first of all of the book went through my typewriter, as it were. So there's nothing in there that I disagree with. We had great discussions. And that is a very helpful process. I also have to say, the book of mine that I like the best in terms of the writing is Loyalties, which I wrote myself, because it's much more of a literary work. I think in a collaboration you lose perhaps some of the literary quality. though happily, as that quote I gave from Garcia Marquez indicates, this book is a really good read. I'd like to go back to something for a minute that I thought about during the break. I think I gave this gentleman a little bit not thoughtful enough answer about the Pope's ethics. Because, yes, this Pope preaches against the prevailing sexual notions of our time and against many other conventional notions of Western morality. His faith, as I said, is a demanding faith. But I think maybe the most important thing about this Pope as an ethicist is that he speaks for universal human values that other leaders of the world have ignored. He speaks about the ugliness of our time. He speaks about, as I said, nationalism, tribalism, racism. Those are ethical matters. He speaks about the other, as he calls the person who is marginalized either economically or physically or by the color of his skin. Only Nelson Mandela among the leaders of the world, and it's a quite different scale, it seems to me, even approaches making this a part of his message. The Pope talks about the primacy of work over capital. He talks about the human conscience. These are things we don't hear as part of our geopolitical discussion in the world today. He is the only leader in the world who makes these pronouncements. And when he makes, I think great numbers of people listen, even those who disagree with him on many, many questions. And then in answer to you seem to be saying, well, the church, the situation with the church has not changed. People are leaving the church. And then you said to me during the break, this Pope would be fired as the chief executive of a corporation because he hadn't produced.
Se ele tivesse, o que eu disse durante o intervalo, foi que se esse Papa tivesse sido contratado para aumentar, com o objetivo de aumentar o público da igreja, ele talvez não tivesse no lugar de Papa, ele teria sido substituído.
Perda
Resultados de longo prazo nós não sabemos. De curto prazo nós sabemos.
I think you're really missing the source of this man's greatness. And I speak of him as somebody who is a great leader with many negative attributes. But the source of his greatness is, among other things, his unwillingness to go along with polls. Every other leader in the world is looking at political polls. This Pope says, to hell with the political polls. I've only got one poll that I've got to answer to, and that's that one. And I think this strikes a real chord with a lot of people because he speaks from conscience. He does not speak from expediency. But also, I think the situation of what kind of church is he going to leave behind, it's a little bit like Napoleon in France. When Napoleon was finished, all his conquests and all the rest, France on the map was the same France it had been when he began. But the fact is the world had changed. The world had become a much different place because of Napoleon. And I think the same can be said of this Pope. In the West, people have left the church. But the world is a different place, and his church is a different place because of this Pope.
Roberto, professor Roberto.
Vamos ver o jornalista Bernstein diante dos seus personagens. Diante de Nixon, o senhor tinha presidente que não representava nada que fosse divino. Representava a nação americana, na sua maioria, e estava preso à lei americana. Quando ele errou, o senhor, inclusive, ajudou a denunciá-lo, ele caiu. Este Papa, nesses aspectos que o senhor julga menores, esse Papa, quando erra, ele chega a dizer, o senhor disse, o senhor cita uma frase dele aqui dentro, ele chega a se dizer, esse povo me ouve apenas, não me ouve, ele se compara a Jesus Cristo. Quer dizer, ele é Deus. Isto muda muito a nossa situação, porque no caso de Nixon, não é? Os Estados Unidos melhorou, mudou, não é? Houve uma maior transparência política, o senhor ajudou, inclusive, nesse aspecto, eu acho que é fundamental a imprensa nessa linha. No entanto, esse Papa continua sendo ele, Deus, e pregando a não democracia, porque não interessa a nós, leigos, não interessa a democracia dentro da igreja. O que nos preocupa é a pregação contra a democracia fora da igreja, isto é, em países como o Brasil, a Sul-América, etc., e inclusive na Europa. Isso que nos preocupa. Ele continuará pregando, e isso mudou sim, porque para a Polônia melhorou. Não sei quanto. Não tanto porque o senhor mostra, inclusive, que os poloneses não estão tão satisfeitos assim com ele. Me parece que a resposta mais adequada seria justamente a resposta dos holandeses, né, que simplesmente silenciaram e não apareceram nas manifestações em apoio a João Paulo II. Lembra um pouco a história daqueles índios indígenas que, quando estavam insatisfeitos com o cacique, saíam da taba, saíam da tribo.
I'm going to interrupt you if I might. You don't like this Pope. That's all right with me. I don't mind if you don't like this Pope. That's fine with me. I think, though, that you are showing a real misunderstanding of what the purpose of this book is, and what the purpose of journalism, of reporting is, and what the purpose of historical inquiry is. In the Nixon years, we did not set out to impeach Richard Nixon. We set out to report the truth. Then, after we reported the truth, the institutions concerned with American life, which is to say the Congress and the judiciary, proceeded to deal with Mr. Nixon. Our job was to illuminate who he was and what he had done. And that's what I've done in this book. I've illuminated who this man is and what he has done. You don't like what he's done. That's fine with me. Many people in the church don't like what he's done. That's fine with me too. I don't like a lot of things that he's done. But that's not the important thing here. And then you go on to say that this book, if I'm reading you correctly, has not had the same effect because the Pope is still preaching. Look, the United States is one kind of institution. It is a democracy. It has a constitution. The church is another kind of institution. It is an autocracy. It is a monarchy. It has no constitution in the same way that the United States has a constitution. Nobody's going to bring impeachment proceedings against this Pope. I think this is a kind of silly discussion.
Um minuto, por favor. O que me espanta é que o senhor trate desses problemas como se esse Papa surgisse do nada. Nesse país aqui, que hoje é uma democracia, nesse país aqui, a Igreja ajudou um golpe de Estado que matou gente, que nos retirou a liberdade, não é? E eu dou graças a Deus, eu sou católico, dou graças a Deus que esse Papa não fosse Papa naquela época, porque a coisa seria muito pior nesta terra e nessa democracia.
But again, I think you need to read a little more carefully, and you have read the book, I can see, that you need to read a little more carefully, particularly the chapters on Chile and Argentina, about the role of the church in the terrible regimes of Pinochet, in the terrible regimes of the colonels. And this Pope's turning a blind eye to it. Again, the man is full of contradictions. Though there is, I think, a strategy that he pursues. And sometimes I think he's morally contradictory. And I think that is particularly true in terms of not applying the same principles of human rights in the Americas that he did in Poland. I'm not going to disagree with you.
Eu tenho uma curiosidade. O senhor, na prática, ajudou a derrubar Richard Nixon com sua reportagem junto com Bob Woodward sobre o caso Watergate. Desde que eu aprendi a ler jornais, eu me acostumei a ver a figura de Richard Nixon como um dos grandes canalhas da nossa época. O homem que mentiu para o povo americano, que obstruiu a justiça, que tramava golpes sujos, apoiou o golpe militar no Chile, é responsável pela morte de milhares de inocentes nos bombardeios de Hanoi, no Vietnã do Norte. Agora, no final da vida do Nixon, ele é reabilitado pela imprensa americana, é tratado como um grande estadista, uma grande figura do nosso tempo. Como você, né, que teve esse papel tão importante na trajetória do Nixon, afinal de contas, se sente vendo esta reviravolta na maneira como a imprensa americana, da qual você faz parte, trata a figura de Nixon?
I don't see it quite the same way. I think that the American people are a very forgiving people. I think that some people, particularly younger people, are forgiving of Nixon. I agree with everything you said about what he did and what a terrible thing he did to the presidency and to the country. I don't agree that he was rehabilitated. In the eyes of some, I think he was rehabilitated, particularly those who harbor certain political beliefs and who have an ideological view of American politics. The best example I can give is that 2 weeks ago, a new set of tapes from the Nixon administration, the White House secret taping system that Nixon installed, was released by the National Archives, and it showed Nixon ordering another break-in. Amazing. We didn't even know that for sure if he ordered the Watergate break-in. We knew he obstructed justice to cover it up. We knew that there were other undercover illegal activities that he had authorized, but Watergate break-in, we never knew whether he authorized. Here he is on another tape. He's in the grave, and this rehabilitated person that you think is rehabilitated is from the grave saying, go in there and break into the Brookings Institution, a think tank in Washington, and get those papers out, go in at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and break in if you have to, goddammit. This is extraordinary. This is not rehabilitation. This is a crook talking. This is a criminal president. I don't think he's been, I think every time...
Os seus livros continuam sendo, sobre o caso Watergate, continuam sendo bastante vendidos nos Estados Unidos. Quer dizer, é um país desmemoriado, como o senhor lembrou, mas os livros continuam sendo editados. As novas gerações não se interessam, tanto quanto as anteriores, pela leitura dos livros que o senhor escreveu sobre o caso Watergate?
Well, they're certainly not selling the kind of numbers they did in 1970, 73 and 74. Look, America, I think the lessons of Watergate have not been applied well by America. I think that, or by journalism. I think that if the Watergate report should have done anything, it should have recommitted us to this idea of the best obtainable version of the truth as the fundament of what we do. Instead, the dominant trends in media in the United States, as in Europe and in America, is toward gossip, sensationalism, the coarse, the vulgar, the stupid, the weird, crazy talk shows. You know, we've always had some of that, but never has these tabloid values, the values of Rupert Murdoch, the press lord of Australia, then Britain, now America, been the dominant values of our profession. But they are becoming the dominant values of media and certainly of broadcasting. And of a lot of newspapers as well. Not all. There's still great newspapers, particularly the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times. I wouldn't say there's a great newspaper in Britain anymore. But back to go ahead.
Depois de 20 anos, os tapes do caso Watergate começaram a ser divulgados para o público. Algum dia a identidade do Garganta Profunda, que era a sua fonte no caso, vai ser revelada?
Yes, we have said that Deep Throat, who is this source that we had, that Bob met with, who occupied a sensitive position in the executive branch of the government, we have decided that when he dies, we will make his identity known. And we've made those arrangements.
O senhor teve várias parcerias literárias que deram certo, tá? Com o Bob Woodward, com o Marco Politi, mas tem uma parceria, não exatamente literária, mas com uma jornalista, com uma escritora, que não deu muito certo, que foi o seu casamento com a Nora Ephron. Como vai essa parceria? Porque ela escreveu um livro, depois da separação, um livro em que um livro demolidor, sobre o relacionamento de vocês, a sua vida pessoal naquele momento, ela com os filhos pequenos, você saindo pela noite em Washington e tomando atitudes ao ver dela irresponsáveis. Como é que vai a relação com essa parceira hoje, com os seus filhos? Você continua vendo ela, os filhos? Como é que é a relação? Já que o senhor falou tanto de fofocas, eu vou fofoca.
I think, incidentally, I'm amazed that on a serious broadcast you would bring this up.
É assunto público.
But more power to you. It surprises me. The really terrific thing is that we have raised two wonderful children. We have been great parents, and that's what we work at together.
Não, eu acho que é interessante saber.
But I certainly. I've been played by Dustin Hoffman in one movie, by Jack Nicholson in another, and the rest of it speaks for itself.
Uma pergunta de técnica jornalística e que traz o assunto todo para o Brasil. Nós tivemos aqui também um presidente que foi derrubado por uma série de denúncias, tanto que muitos jornais adotaram o nome do caso como Gate, fazendo o jogo com Watergate. Né? Acontece que no Brasil as coisas não foram mais ou menos como aconteceram consigo. Né? Quer dizer, nós publicamos denúncias e fomos investigá-las 3 semanas depois, mais ou menos.
Ou mais.
Né? Ou mais. Eu queria que você elaborasse um pouco, quer dizer, todo esse trabalho de receber uma denúncia e fazer o checking, depois o contra-checking. Isso é jornalismo investigativo, né? Porque nós estamos vivendo no Brasil hoje um jornalismo de denúncias, o denuncismo, que tem criado situações terríveis, embaraçosas, é um lynching de algumas pessoas, um lynching moral de algumas pessoas. Eu queria que você, como um técnico e um grande mestre de jornalismo, elaborasse um pouco sobre essa questão.
Eu queria adendar a pergunta do Diniz, está na mesma sequência, que é a seguinte. Nixon sofreu acusações, foi reeleito. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter não sofreram.
No. Nixon was not reelected.
Não, foi reeleito.
Nixon resigned. Nixon resigned.
Eu sei, mas ele foi eleito antes. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter não sofreram quase acusações. Ronald Reagan sofreu acusações, foi reeleito. O Bill Clinton sofreu acusações, foi reeleito. Eu queria que você me explicasse alguma coisa nessa relação com os jornalistas. Hoje, em relação ao Bill Clinton, ele também tem acusações e foi eleito novamente. Essas acusações, ou elas não são verdadeiras, ou está faltando Carl Bernstein de novo para fazer a investigação, ou está faltando um garganta profunda para isso. Qual é a verdade jornalística nessa lógica?
Wow! Whoa! Ho! Anybody else? You guys
Bastante.
All right. First of all, I don't believe the job of the press is to be a prosecutor. I believe the job of a prosecutor is to be a prosecutor. Our job is to find out what's going on, what's really going on. I don't believe that there's some pseudoscience called investigative journalism. I think all good reporting is the same thing. Whether you're reporting on a football game, whether you're reporting on the presidency, whether you're reporting on Congress, whether you're reporting on business. The best obtainable version of the truth. What does it mean to get the best obtainable version of the truth. How did we get the best obtainable version of the truth in His Holiness John Paul II and the hidden history of our time? We went to talk to the people who knew the man and the situation the best. And we listened. I believe that reporters are awful listeners. And maybe the reason I've been successful as a reporter is I'm a better listener than most reporters. I go in to see someone, and I don't go in with a preconceived notion of what the story is. I'm not wedded, or if I have a preconceived notion of what it is, I'm not wedded to that, because I know the wonderful thing about being a reporter is I'm going to be surprised. The story is not going to be what I think it is. At the beginning of Watergate, I was absolutely convinced that the CIA was behind the break-in at Watergate. I never thought for a minute that Richard Nixon and his administration were behind it. But I wasn't wed to this idea. I went out and I talked to people, and soon it became apparent that the Nixon people were responsible, not the CIA. So, but today, when you talk about it denouncing journalism, I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
Crusading.
But I'm more interested. I think we learn more when we listen. People said, how are you going to get into the Vatican, Bernstein? You know, it's like the Kremlin there. Well, it is like the Kremlin a bit. But I went and I called people up and I was respectful and I said, I want to know about this man. Tell me about this man. The same way people told me about Nixon and what was going on in his White House. The people who were sources of information in the Nixon years were people who worked for Richard Nixon. They weren't Democrats. They weren't his opponents. I think that I don't want to generalize too much because there's still some great reporting being done. I think, though, that Watergate itself threw an awful lot of attention that journalists have gotten, that we have gotten particularly, that there is a tendency to look at our function as prosecutorial, as to catch people lying. I think we have forgotten that very often that real life is mostly in a gray area. It's not black, it's not white. That we are beginning to ask of public officials standards that no human being could meet. I mean, come on, all of us have had problems in our lives. I mean, this gentleman referred to my marriage. I mean, we've all had problems in our lives. That's what life is about, and how we deal with problems. At the same time, when you have the truth is also very much about context. Our journalism lacks context today.
O senhor acha que...
C-O-N-T-E-X-T.
Silvestre, o senhor acha que esse tipo de jornalismo, jornalismo investigativo ou a boa reportagem, como o senhor fala, ainda tem espaço na imprensa contemporânea, na imprensa de hoje?
Yes. I think, you know, we've got some great newspapers, we've got some great reporters. I think you got to remember that really great reporting has always been the exception. Look at Vietnam. Great reporting came out of Vietnam, David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, others. But they were the exception. Most of the reporting out of Vietnam was average, it was lousy. We're not much different, it seems to me, reporters, than doctors. You know, 5% are really great, and at the other end of the scale, about 15% of them will kill you. The same is probably true of us. We're a reflection of society at large. I think more important is that not just newspapers, but driving this whole thing that we call media is now a marketing mentality in which truth has little to do with why we do what we do. And the result is a conversation in our societies, a cacophonous conversation that is not reflective of reality because it is distorted by celebrity and our absolute obsession with celebrity, with gossip, with sensationalism, with, as I said, the weird, the stupid, the coarse. I'll give you an example. In New York, the country's most sophisticated media market, there was a 5-part series done on the 11 p.m. news. So they called it an investigative series. They sent their biggest reporters out on the story. They promoted the series every day. You know what it was called? It was called How Do They Get Those People? And it was a 5-part report about where the daytime talk shows got their freaks. And it featured a promo of Phil Donahue, a great talk show host, interviewing a man with a baby pacifier in his mouth.
Qual é a sua opinião sobre um jornalista como colunista da Newsweek que fez um livro assinando anônimo sobre os bastidores da campanha do Bill Clinton?
I don't have a big problem about it. I think it's a lot of hullabaloo over nothing. I think our real ethical problem, we always have these meetings of journalists, and journalists sit around and debate all day about this ethical problem and that ethical problem that might or might not develop. I think the real ethical problem is that we no longer are broadcasting and putting in our papers and covering what we know is news. That is no longer what we are doing most of the time. We are instead giving readers and viewers what we think they want. And they want talk shows, and they want sensationalism, and they want gossip, and they want people yelling at each other from the left and the right with no interest in anything but confrontation and controversy. That, to me, is the ethical problem that we ought to be looking at. Whether Joe Klein wrote a novel anonymously doesn't bother me. What Joe Klein did that did bother me is that he denied it. So I think he undermined his own truthfulness. He should have just smiled and said, well, I don't know, did I write it or did I not write it? And let it go at that. Yes.
Uma questão ética bem concreta. Recentemente, o tabloide inglês The Sun publicou uma série de fotos de um casal em atitudes comprometedoras. Atribuindo essas fotos à princesa Diana e ao seu namorado. Dias depois, o editor do The Sun pediu desculpas ao público, dizendo que as fotos não eram da princesa Diana, nem do seu namorado, mas de um casal de artistas muito parecido com eles. Se fossem verdadeiras as fotos, se justificaria a publicação? Quer dizer, quais são para o senhor os limites ou as relações que devem existir entre o direito de informação, que é um direito democrático essencial, e o direito à privacidade, que também é uma garantia da liberdade individual?
Well, I don't think you can make any hard and fast rules. And I also think one of the great things that we have in the United States is absolute freedom of the press. The Constitution says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech of the press, and that's the case, that people have recourse against newspapers, against broadcasts through libel laws. But you cannot prohibit somebody really from printing something. You can take action afterwards to recover damages, and I think that's as it should be. I think common sense ought to guide this, but the fact is there are always going to be papers like The Sun, there are always going to be papers like the National Enquirer, people who are in the public eye ought to be smart enough not to go out in public parks and make love if that is what actually happens. I mean, a little bit of common sense on both sides ought to prevail. And at the same time, if some photographer thinks he's got a right to come into your house and take a picture of you in your house, you ought to have the son of a bitch locked up for trespassing. I mean, we need to be bound by the law, but there are plenty of laws. There's laws of trespass, there are laws, but clearly we often go over to the other side of the line in invading people's privacy. It's always a conflict. I'll give you an example, a horrifying thing during Watergate when we named the president's two top aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, as controlling a secret fund that paid for the bugging at Watergate and other undercover illegal activities. Well, the next day, there were 50, 60 reporters and photographers camped out on these guys' lawns, and their poor children had to run a gauntlet on their way to school through this. I was horrified. I mean, I think the press gets itself into terrible trouble through its arrogance. I think that, but there's always going to be The Sun. The Sun doesn't care about arrogance, and the National Enquirer doesn't give a damn about arrogance, so forget about it. But I think that those of us who are in a position to do so, who work for decent newspapers, who work for networks, who work for Globo, et cetera, I think we're going to take a stand at a certain point and say, we don't do certain things. that we conduct ourselves decently. I think that we are getting ourselves into terrible trouble through our arrogance, acting as if no laws of common sense apply to us. And I think it undermines our credibility.
Você revelou aqui uma visão bastante crítica em relação à imprensa e à mídia americana, no sentido de que essa imprensa está distante da verdade, da verdadeira realidade dos Estados Unidos.
No. Much of it, some of it. But again, as far as I know, there are no other papers in the world like the New York Times or the Washington Post.
A minha pergunta
and also, again, I don't want. I'm always wary of black and white pronouncements, and if I made one, I hope that I can correct that impression. I think that our media is tipping in the direction that I've been talking about. But I also think we have some great reporting, some great political reporting on television, for instance.
Sem dúvida. Um colega seu, James Fellows, ele escreveu um livro em que ele faz uma crítica bastante contundente aos jornalistas nos Estados Unidos, no sentido de que eles se tornaram os jornalistas dos principais jornais, dos principais veículos de televisão, uma elite com um nível de vida muito superior, um padrão de vida muito superior à média dos norte-americanos, com salários extremamente altos, né, com um padrão mais próximo de banqueiros, de empresários, e que perderam o contato com a vida real, como vivem os americanos médios, e que isso acaba se traduzindo num distanciamento da cobertura dos jornais em relação à vida real nos Estados Unidos. Aqui no Brasil a gente pode sentir algo parecido também. O senhor, você se inclui nessa crítica?
Well, one, I don't think that's exactly what Jim wrote. Jim wrote a thing saying basically that he thinks that reporters should not accept big fees for speeches, and if they do, that they should report where that comes from. I don't agree with your question, with the way you stated your question. I think it's a terrific thing if reporters now finally make a decent living, because among other things, hopefully it'll enable them to go off and write books. And take the time to do really thoughtful reporting. Hopefully it'll help their kids get a better education. I think the idea that a reporter's got to be poor is crazy. I think the fact that reporters have joined the middle class or even some above that.
Eu não falo do jornalista médio, eu falo dos top jornalistas, da elite de jornalistas, que é quem controla realmente as decisões dentro das redações dos jornais e da televisão, etc. Os jornalistas médios, eles não têm esses salários tão altos, etc. Mas quem decide, sim, tem os grandes colunistas, os editores top dos principais jornais e televisão.
Let me tell you, the top editors always made a lot of money. There's nothing new about that. I don't agree with this kind of conspiratorial view of the process. I think, incidentally, that the problem with Washington journalism has always been that reporters in Washington are out of touch with what goes on in the rest of the country. There's nothing new about this. I think that our coverage of Washington is often much more about the process than about the real issues. I can give all kinds of criticisms, but I do not think that there's some kind of elite that is sitting there in some kind of conspiracy because they're all making a lot of money, that this has put them out of touch with things. I have always thought, first of all, almost every great story I know about has been obtained by a reporter. It's never been assigned by an editor. You know, editors, what do they know? They're in the office. They want to fill their paper up with the best stuff that their reporters will give them, but it's up to the reporter. It's the reporter that's out there. And let's say your reporter covers City Hall. The editor obviously wants him to file 5 stories a day about what the city council did, what the mayor said, and the big events of the day. And the reporter ought to file those stories. But the really good reporter, the great reporter, he goes out and finds other stories on his own. The editor, he doesn't tell him anything about what that story is going to be. If you think the editor was telling David Halberstam in Vietnam, or Neil Sheehan in Vietnam, or for that matter, Woodward or I, what the story was, forget about it. He didn't know what the story was. We knew what the story was because we went out and spent the time to do it. I think the problem is reporters. I think reporters are looking for quick fixes. I think reporters are looking too often for easy stories, creating controversy, not being listeners. I don't think this is some kind of... Now, you got a problem. The way to get ahead often in media and journalism today is to write a sensational story. Well, I think we've got to resist it. I think that and I also have to say, I've never known an editor to turn down a good story. No matter how awful I thought this editor might be, I've never known an editor to turn down a good story. You're an editor. You ever know a good editor turn down a good story? Never. It doesn't happen.
Voltando à política, só uma questão política. O senhor cobriu os anos Nixon e agora acompanha como jornalista e como cidadão americano os anos Clinton. Existe já li em vários lugares essa comparação entre o Nixon e o Clinton, de que eles são homens de extrema habilidade política e tiveram a competência de roubar as bandeiras do partido contrário, da oposição. O senhor concorda com isso? Quer dizer, Nixon ocupou o espaço dos democratas e com isso ele se elegeu.
O Clinton é considerado mais chato.
Foi para a direita e com isso se reelegeu.
Mais chato.
É isso?
No, not exactly. Nixon was a very acute political observer. His observations, he would have been a great political journalist. The country would have been a hell of a lot better if that would have been better off, if that's what he would have done. And Bill Clinton is probably the best politician, pure politician, electoral politician, analyst of what people are saying and hearing and what they want than anybody certainly that I've seen in my lifetime. He's a brilliant campaigner. I'm wary of comparisons between Nixon and particularly when it comes to Whitewater and Watergate, which I don't think there's any comparison. That doesn't mean the special prosecutor might not come up with something, but it's about, Whitewater is not about abuses of the presidency, abuse of presidential power, at least as far as I know thus far. I think there's an essential difference between Bill Clinton and Richard. I think Richard Nixon was anomalous among our presidents because I think that Richard Nixon's vision was always of himself. I think he was a narcissistic politician, that his interest was really in Nixon. It wasn't in the country. It was in the country's greatness if Nixon was making it great. I think there's never been a president like this. And I think very much Bill Clinton's persona is about doing great things if he could do them. It's not about Bill Clinton. It's not about, there was a selfishness to Nixon's persona that other presidents just have not had, not Ronald Reagan, not Gerald Ford, not Jimmy Carter, not Dwight Eisenhower, certainly not Bill Clinton.
Sr. Bernstein, infelizmente o nosso programa está chegando ao final. Eu gostaria de fazer uma última pergunta. Se o senhor tem informações sobre o real estado de saúde do Papa.
Well, we devote considerable space to his health. He's a very sick man. He has Parkinson's, and I think it's because of this book that the Vatican has confirmed that he has a Parkinson's-like disease. He's had a precancerous tumor removed. He recently underwent surgery for an appendectomy. They say in the Vatican that there was no sign of another tumor, and I hope they're telling the truth about that, and I don't think there's any reason that they would not tell the truth about that. I hope there's not. This Pope has been shot. He's obviously someone who's suffering, But again, he sees his suffering in a mystical way. That this is how he identifies with Christ. He very much wants to be alive for the millennium. Again, when he was elected at the conclave by the cardinals, there was a moment of doubt about whether he should accept the papacy or not. And it was actually right before the ballot that elected him. And he threw himself into the arms of the great Cardinal Wyszynski of Poland and said, can I accept this? And Wyszynski said, you have to. One, for Poland, and two, to bring the church into the third millennium. And this Pope wants to be alive for the third millennium. And he is a willful man. He is a very willful man, and I would not bet against him being alive to usher in the third millennium, though he is a very sick man. But also, I think he sees, we are going to watch now a pope with a serious disease of the central nervous system. And I think he's going to use it as a lesson for afflicted people and how they're regarded everywhere. That again, this pope talks about the other, those who are marginalized and looked at as different. And that includes the physically ill or the physically hard to look at. Here we now have a pope whose hands shake, and the shaking is going to get worse. I think he's going to use this as a lesson for humanity. I mean, I think these are some of the things that make him so remarkable, and at the same time, there's always the contradiction of, yes, he's the authoritarian, but he also is this great and fascinating man.
Ok, muito obrigado, Sr. Bernstein, por essa sua presença aqui.
Obrigado.
Eu gostaria muito de agradecer a presença dos nossos entrevistadores. Nós tivemos hoje uma bancada excepcional. Gostaria de também agradecer a sua atenção e lembrar que o Roda Viva volta na próxima segunda-feira, sempre às 10h30 da noite. Até lá, uma boa semana para todos e uma boa noite.